North Burma, March the 4th, 1944. Before dawn, the jungle here is the color of wet ash, and the air is so thick with moisture that sound travels strangely. A man can hear his own heartbeat before he can hear footsteps 20 feet away. Somewhere south of a river called the Numpiek, a platoon of American soldiers lies motionless in the mud, waiting. They have been waiting all night. 40 miles north, at a Japanese divisional headquarters, Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka has just been told something that does not make sense to him. An enemy force, Americans, on the Asian mainland, which has not happened before in this war, is operating behind his lines, not raiding, not scouting, operating. Tanaka commands the 18th Division, the same division that took Singapore, the same division that chased the British out of Malaya in humiliation. He does not believe a scratch unit of a few thousand Americans is a serious threat to his flank. His response is immediate, and it is contemptuous. He orders 2 of his infantry regiments south with instructions to find this American force and destroy it. He does not yet know its name. In a few months he will. This is not a story about who marched the farthest or who suffered the worst jungle in the Pacific War, though both of those things are true here. This is a story about how a Japanese general's own order to destroy an American unit became, 4 months later, a Japanese general's own explanation for why his division could not hold northern Burma. The Americans he was chasing called themselves the 5307th Composite Unit. History remembers them by the name a newspaper reporter gave them almost by accident, Merrill's Marauders. To understand why General Tanaka underestimated them so badly, you first have to understand what this unit actually was, and what almost nobody, including the men who volunteered for it, was told before they signed up. In August of 1943, Allied leaders meeting at the Quebec Conference agreed to something the United States Army had never done before: field an American long-range penetration force, modeled directly on the British Chindits, to fight deep behind Japanese lines in Burma. The theater commander, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, a man so notoriously blunt that even his own staff called him Vinegar Joe to his face, needed American infantry to support a much larger Chinese offensive aimed at recapturing northern Burma and reopening a land route to China. The War Department put out a call in the fall of 1943 for volunteers for a dangerous and hazardous mission. No unit name, no destination, just those 2 words. Roughly 3,000 men answered. Many came from jungle-tested outfits already fighting in the Pacific, an entire battalion of them Guadalcanal veterans, some still carrying malaria in their blood. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to transfer 274 combat-experienced volunteers from the fighting in New Guinea and Bougainville. A smaller number came out of military stockades. Given a choice between a jail cell and Burma, they'd be nicknamed the Dead-End Kids by the men around them. On the last day of October 1943, the force landed in Bombay and began training in the jungles of central India, training in demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, jungle navigation, mule handling, and the specific discipline of moving and fighting for weeks with no fixed supply line behind them. The man chosen to lead them was Brigadier General Frank Dow Merrill, 39 years old, a West Point graduate of the class of 1929 who had gone on to study engineering at MIT, and strangely enough, to study the Japanese language in Tokyo in 1938 while serving as an assistant military attaché. He had been in Rangoon on a flying assignment for MacArthur when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, and he'd spent the 2 years since as Stilwell's operations officer, watching the British and Chinese get pushed out of Burma in one of the longest retreats in American military history. Now Stilwell handed him command of the only American ground combat unit in the entire China-Burma-India theater. Officially, it was the 5307th Composite Unit, provisional, the word provisional meaning bluntly that the Army intended to disband it the moment its mission was finished. War correspondents who watched the unit train on the firing ranges started calling it something else. The name stuck before the men had fired a shot in anger. They would need 6 combat teams of roughly 400 men each, organized in 3 battalions, and they would rely on nearly 700 pack animals, mostly mules, to carry the mortars, radios, and ammunition that trucks could never bring through this terrain. One retired lieutenant general who served in the unit, Sam Wilson, later summed up what volunteering had actually meant in 4 words that have stuck with veterans of the outfit ever since. A plan existed to get them into Burma. No plan existed to get them out. What Merrill's men were about to walk into was not a demoralized, retreating Japanese army. The 18th Division under General Tanaka was one of the more accomplished formations in the Imperial Japanese Army, the same division that had spearheaded the campaign down the Malay Peninsula in early 1942 and helped force the British surrender of Singapore. the worst defeat in British military history. These were experienced jungle fighters who had never lost a major engagement to a Western army. When Stilwell's Chinese divisions began pushing south into the Yukon Valley in December 1943, Tanaka's men held the advantage of terrain, of local knowledge, and of 2 straight years without a serious battlefield setback. Tanaka's assumption, by every account of his conduct in these opening weeks, was straightforward. Whatever American unit had appeared behind his lines was a nuisance to be swatted aside quickly so his division could get back to the business of stopping the Chinese. He did not reorganize his defense around it. He ordered 2 regiments, all of Singapore and Malaya, a campaign that took the supposedly impregnable British fortress at Singapore in just 70 days, humiliating an empire that had ruled the region for a century. The men of the 18th Division did not think of themselves as an ordinary garrison unit standing between the marauders and the road north. They thought of themselves as men who did not lose. That certainty had been earned in real battles, against real armies, and nothing in their experience of the war so far had given them any reason to doubt it. To understand why what happened at Wallabum mattered so much, you first have to understand what the marauders were actually being asked to do with the men they had. On the 24th of February 1944, roughly 2,750 marauders crossed into Burma on foot, climbing over the Patkai mountain range with their mules and their 60mm mortars, beginning a march that would eventually total close to 1,000 miles before the campaign was finished. Their orders were simple to state and nearly impossible to execute. Get behind the Japanese 18th Division, cut its supply and retreat routes, and hold that ground while 2 Chinese divisions pressed the enemy from the front. It was the oldest trick in the infantry playbook, the hammer and the anvil, except that in this case the anvil was 3,000 lightly armed American volunteers. Alone, deep in territory, the Japanese army had controlled without serious challenge since 1942. Stillwell picked his spot on the map with his finger and told Merrill this would be the place. Wallabum, a scatter of huts near the southern end of the Yukon Valley, 15 miles south of the main Japanese base at Mangkwin. On the 3rd of March, the Marauders' 3rd Battalion dug into a roadblock position there, cutting the route the 18th Division would need to fall back along. Tanaka learned the same day that Americans had gotten behind him, and he reacted exactly as a commander of an undefeated division should be expected to react. He turned his men south and attacked. What followed was not the quick, contemptuous brushing aside that Tanaka's veterans might reasonably have expected. The Japanese came forward with bayonets fixed, in the massed assaults that had shattered British positions across Malaya 2 years before, screaming the old battle cry that had terrorized so many defenders already, Banzai. The Marauders had never fought a set-piece infantry battle before in their lives. They held anyway. Their training at Diagar had drilled them relentlessly in fire discipline, in integrating machine guns and light mortars into a single defensive web, and in a jungle roadblock outside Wallabum, that training turned into something the Japanese had not encountered from American infantry before, a wall of accurate, sustained, coordinated fire that did not break under pressure. By the time the fighting at Wallabum was finished, the 3rd Battalion alone had killed somewhere between 400 and 500 Japanese soldiers. General Merrill, writing about the 3 days of fighting afterward, put it plainly. Between his men and the Chinese, they had forced the Japanese to withdraw farther in those 3 days than the enemy had given up ground in the previous 3 months of the entire campaign. There was no time to rest in the glow of it. 2 fresh objectives waited to the south, Shajuzup and Inkangatong, 2 more roadblocks the Marauders needed to slam shut along the Kaming Road, the vital artery Tanaka's division depended on for supply and retreat. The 1st Battalion marched for Shajuzup. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions turned toward Inkangatong, spreading the entire unit across a loop of jungle 30 to 40 miles wide, deep behind enemy lines, each battalion effectively alone if anything went wrong. Something went wrong. It happened during the fighting for Inkangatong, when American radio intercepts caught something the Japanese never intended to broadcast. A Japanese sergeant, unaware that anyone on the American side understood his dialect, radioed a report to his superior expressing open anxiety that his ammunition dump was guarded by only 3 men. On the American side, a Japanese-American staff sergeant named Roy Matsumoto happened to speak that exact dialect. He translated the transmission in real time. Within hours, the 2nd Battalion had located the poorly guarded dump and destroyed it, a small tactical strike, but proof, in the enemy's own words, of exactly how thin and improvised the Japanese defense had become trying to cover a front that kept dissolving behind them. It was around this same period that Tanaka, sensing the danger of having his supply lines gutted piece by piece, threw the bulk of 2 infantry regiments south in a determined effort to crush the American force once and for all before it could do any more damage. The blow fell hardest on the 2nd Battalion, which had pushed ahead to a hilltop village called Nhpumga, spanning barely 400 yards long and 200 feet wide, high ground, but not much of it, and not nearly enough room to disperse against a determined Japanese assault. On the 28th of March, roughly 1,300 Japanese troops surrounded the position and began a siege that would grind on for 11 brutal days. What happened at Nhpumga over the next 2 weeks was not the kind of fighting Merrill's marauders had trained for. They were a mobile raiding force built for movement and surprise, and Nhpumga forced them into something closer to a medieval siege: dig in, hold the perimeter, and wait under constant artillery and mortar fire while the dead accumulated faster than anyone could bury them. Men who fought there later gave the position a grim, unofficial name, Maggot Hill, for the smell of the dead mules and the unburied Japanese bodies rotting in the tropical heat just beyond the wire. Water discipline broke down, disease crept in behind the shelling. And still the position held because 2 pack howitzers had been flown in from India, and because the rest of the 5,307th, unwilling to abandon their own, fought their way toward the encirclement from outside, hammering the Japanese rear and supply lines even as their comrades held on inside the perimeter. On the 9th of April, Easter Sunday, 1944, the siege broke. The Japanese withdrew. When the final count was made, it showed 52 Americans killed and 163 wounded, set against roughly 400 Japanese dead left on the ground around the position. A division that had conquered Singapore in 70 days had just spent 11 days failing to erase a single besieged American battalion, at a cost of nearly 8 of its own men for every American killed. But the siege had done something to the marauders that combat alone had not. When the men who remained were finally counted, the unit stood at roughly 1,600 effectives, barely half its original strength, and disease, not Japanese bullets, had done most of the damage. Amoebic dysentery tore through the ranks after the marauders' camp mixed with Chinese troops using nearby rivers as latrines. Scrub typhus and malaria followed close behind. Merrill himself, exhausted past the point his body could sustain, suffered a heart attack at his headquarters in the hilltop village and had to be evacuated by light aircraft, handing command to his executive officer, Colonel Charles Hunter, for what remained of the campaign. There was no extended rest waiting for the men who were left. Stilwell had one final target in mind, and he considered it worth almost any cost: the airfield at Myitkyina, the only all-weather airstrip in northern Burma, and the key to everything the campaign had been fought for. On the 17th of May, 1944, roughly 1,300 surviving marauders, men who had already marched close to 1,000 miles and buried friends at Wallobum and Nhpumga, climbed over the 2,000-meter Kumon mountain range on a 100-kilometer march, using their remaining mules to haul what supplies they had left, and came down on the far side directly onto the Myitkyina airfield. The Japanese garrison there was not expecting an attack from that direction, over terrain most maps treated as impassable. The assault that morning was a complete surprise and a complete success. The airfield fell in hours. The town of Myitkyina itself did not fall so easily. What should have been the campaign's triumphant final act instead became a second siege, this one lasting 78 brutal days through the worst of the monsoon, as a Japanese garrison that had been steadily and quietly reinforced, eventually numbering somewhere around 4,600 men, far more than American intelligence had estimated, dug in and refused to yield the town around the airfield the marauders had already taken. By the time Myitkyina finally fell on the 3rd of August, 1944, the unit that had once numbered close to 3,000 volunteers had been reduced to roughly 15% of its original strength. The Japanese commander escaped the town with several hundred of his men. The rest of his garrison, by most accounts, were killed or captured almost to the last man. What the Japanese 18th Division was ultimately forced to reckon with was not a single dramatic confession written down for history in some captured diary. It was something harder to argue with, a documented result. A division that had never been stopped, not in Malaya, not in Singapore, not anywhere in 2 years of war, had been driven back at Wallobum, bled at Shajizup and in Kangatong, defeated outright in an 11-day siege at Nhpumga that costed 8 men for every American it managed to kill, and finally outmaneuvered entirely at Myitkyina by a force that climbed a mountain range the Japanese hadn't bothered to defend because they assumed no one could cross it. The U.S. Army's own official history, written in the years immediately after the war from the unit's own after-action reports, states the outcome without embellishment. In 5 major engagements and 30 smaller ones, the 5,307th met and defeated the veteran soldiers of the Japanese 18th Division. not delayed, not harassed, defeated, a word the Army's historians did not use loosely about an enemy division with Singapore and Malaya in its record. The volunteers who marched into Burma in February of 1944 had been recruited off a poster that promised nothing except danger. Many of them had come from prison stockades, offered a pardon instead of a parole board. The army that sent them in had no real precedent for what a unit like this could do, because nothing like it had ever been tried by American soldiers before. What came out the other side of the Hukong Valley, of Nh Pumga, of the Kumon Range, was not a unit that had proven it was tougher than anyone doubted. It was proof, written in the movements of an undefeated Japanese division forced backward for the first time in the war, that toughness was never really the question. The 5,307th were disbanded within days of taking Myitkyina, folded quietly into the 475th Infantry, as though the army wasn't quite sure what to do with a unit built for one campaign and one campaign only. But somewhere in northern Burma, in the silence after 11 days of shelling at a hilltop position nobody back home had ever heard of, an elite Japanese division learned something about 3,000 American volunteers that it never got the chance to forget.